Good afternoon, everyone. Perhaps before we begin, I may clarify, I've retired from St. Mary's, which means a lot more work with no pay. I'm now full-time faculty member at the PhD Development Studies program at the University of Zacatecas. It's a state university in a neighboring state, in the same area, development studies. First, I'd like to thank the Institute for the invitation to speak to you today about the political situation in Latin America, particularly as it relates to some of my recent work on what might be described as the class struggle, which is a struggle based on the resistance of different classes, groups and communities in the popular sector against the advance of capitalism, which, as we all know, is a system based fundamentally on the exploitation of both labor and nature. A system designed for the purpose of accumulating capital in order to profit the owners of the means of production, the rich and powerful, as it happens. At the moment, we, both in Latin America and elsewhere, are at the crossroads of fundamental social change, of conflicting political forces, some pushing to the right, and the consolidation of a neoliberal regime based on the belief in the virtues of free market capitalism. Other forces pushing to the left towards a more progressive regime based on the vision of another world of inclusive development and social and environmental justice. What I propose here this afternoon is a brief review, I'll try for 40 minutes, of how these conflicting forces are playing out in Latin America, which we can view as a laboratory for testing out different strategies, different policies that are at play in the development process. And also, the study of Latin American politics is very useful for providing lessons, understanding how different forces of change can be and are being mobilized by different groups, different classes, either to the right or to the left. Latin America has just undergone, I'm sure you probably know, what has been described by scholars as a pink and red tide of regime change. That is a progressive cycle of governments in the search of a more inclusive form of development. As we know, neoliberalism, the neoliberal agenda is extremely exclusive, designed to benefit essentially, primarily if not exclusively, the rich and the powerful. Now this progressive cycle seems to have come to an end in the last few years, as of 2015 more or less, in another swing of the electoral politics, this time towards the far right. And when I say the pendulum of electoral politics, 2018, 2019, 14 governments are going to change their president and their regime. So this is what I'm saying, it's a very important period of change to determine which way is the pendulum going to swing, to the left or to the right. Half of those regimes have already been established this year, half last year, rather, 2018. Yeah, we're 2019, right? And others in 2019. The pendulum of electoral politics has most recently swung to what we might call the far right. Not just the center right, which has been in power for many years, but the far right. Which, well, I guess it includes neoliberal, authoritarian and populist regimes like the one established most recently in Brazil, in the mold of Donald Bush. There are many Americans here, I don't want to step on too many toes. Anyway,
step away.
Anyway, this pendulum swing in electoral politics provides a useful point for my review of political developments in the region. Development, as I said, can be understood through the can be well understood through the lens of class struggle. I've just finished a book on this topic, as it happens, which I can make available to anyone interested in electronic form. It's called The Class Struggle in Latin America. The first point I would make about this struggle is that it takes different forms in different conditions and circumstances. Also, every advance of capital, that is profit-seeking investment, in the development process generates forces of resistance. For example, throughout the 20th century, until at least the end of the 70s, the class struggle in Latin America anyway, predominantly took the form of struggle for land in the countryside. A land struggle involving resistance against forces that led to or were leading to the dispossession and expulsion of millions of small-scale agricultural producers on the land, peasants or family farmers, impoverishing them, forcing them to migrate in the search of work or a livelihood, a better future for their families. This land struggle predominantly took the form of social movements of rural landless, rural workers or peasants, if you like, dispossessed peasants, what the agencies of international development, such as the World Bank, describe as the rural poor. What they don't say is that they helped impoverish them. In addition to this struggle, the great class struggle of the 20th century was based on the resistance of workers, the working class, for higher wages and improved working conditions, in resistance to the forces of capitalist development based on exploitation of labor, that is, the extraction from their labor of a surplus used to generate profits and fuel the capital accumulation process. These forces of resistance and associated struggles took the form of a labor movement, as we know, which, like the land struggle in Latin America, was weakened and more or less destroyed toward the end of the 70s and the 80s. And Latin America was not the only place where this movement was destroyed, its forces of resistance disarticulated. The US certainly is part of that, as is Canada. Creating conditions for a new cycle of capital accumulation, capitalist development, a new cycle for the advance of capital, that is corporates, foreign investments, in the search of profits, markets, and significantly for Latin America, natural resources that are sold on the world market. Resource-seeking capital, we might say, invested in extraction of natural resources such as minerals and metals, fossil fuels like oil and gas, and different agro-food products. To export these natural resources, usually in unprocessed or primary form, to meet the growing demand for these commodities on the world market. To facilitate this development process, the World Bank and the IMF and other agencies of capitalist development, which are effectively under the control of the US government, it's always the US president that appoints the president of the World Bank, for example. And I think Trump has just recently, or is in the process of appointing another president, and again someone who is against the agenda of the World Bank, the development agenda of the World Bank. This is, of course, par for the course for Trump, to appoint people who know nothing about the area that they're supposed to take govern in. And of course, this applies as well to Trump himself, who apparently, according to at least one person, knows more about anything and everything than anyone else. To facilitate this process, development process, which from a Latin America or a critical development studies perspective could be viewed as the imperial state, looking at the United States as an imperial state in terms of its projection of state power in the national interest, in its national interest. In the 80s and 90s, to implement this development process in the 80s and 90s, the quote state, or these agencies, World Bank, etc., implemented a program of structural reform designed to integrate economies in the region, and other regions, of course, into what they call a new world order of neoliberal globalization, based on the belief in the virtues of free market capitalism. This was a system established in the early 80s, in 83, by 89, 6 years later, more or less this neoliberal program had to be modified because of the clear evidence that it wasn't working. And it was generating more poverty, more inequalities, and generating forces of resistance that were destabilizing the governments, which basically led the guardians of this new world order to go back to the drawing board and to redesign the structural just program, which is what they did in the 90s. I will talk about that later. We don't have time to go into details on this. Suffice it to say that the end result for Latin America was a massive invasion of resource-seeking extractive capital, or if you like, foreign investments, and the destruction of forces of production in both agriculture and industry that had been built up in the previous decades under the development state, and also the accelerated expulsion of the dispossessed and impoverished small-scale producers or peasants, the rural poor, who were forced to abandon their communities and then encouraged by the World Bank to take the development pathway out of rural poverty, namely migration. Of course, the Trump administration views these impoverished rural migrants, the product, a large part of US policies and the operations of US corporations, very differently, as criminals, mostly criminalized in the search for political asylum at the border. Another outcome of these structural adjustment programs or structural reforms in macroeconomic policies foisted upon, imposed on governments in the region by the US was the generation of new forces of resistance in the form of social movements, new social movements, which were mobilized by the rural poor, those who chose the path of resistance rather than the pathway of migration, in protest against austerity measures and neoliberal policies, and investments and actions of US corporations that were destroying their livelihoods. So in the 90s, it was the heyday of peasant social movements, very powerful social movements that in many cases managed not to reverse but to halt the neoliberal policy agenda. And by the end, as it happened by the end of the 90s, this neoliberal policy agenda was totally discredited and abandoned by a lot of people, policymakers, etc. So the political activism of these peasant movements was responsible for creating the conditions for discrediting this neoliberal policy agenda, which created conditions for the political class on the left to gain power in the early part of this new, early years of the of this millennium. Based essentially on a program or a policy of moving beyond neoliberalism, creating a post-neoliberal program, rejecting the neoliberal policy agenda of globalization, privatization, liberalization, decentralization, as I said, creating conditions for the emergence of what we call a progressive cycle of left-leaning, post-neoliberal regimes oriented towards the search for a more inclusive form of development based in particular on poverty reduction. These left-leaning progressive policy regimes were formed first in Venezuela with the election of Hugo Chavez in '98, then in Argentina and Brazil in 2003, then in 2005, 2006 in Bolivia and Ecuador, and then in Uruguay and elsewhere, almost all in South America, although this progressive cycle, I guess you could also find some elements of it in Central America, Honduras and Salvador. Outliers in this development were Colombia, which is the US administration's main ally in the region. Allies in what many Latin Americans view as an imperialist war waged against them. And Mexico, Colombia and Mexico, they were two countries that did not participate in this progressive cycle. They stuck to the neoliberal agenda from the beginning, well, to now, or at least, yeah, till now. We'll see what happens with the new president. And also, they stuck with alignment with the United States. These progressive regimes in South America replaced the neoliberal policy agenda, which is in place everywhere in the region, with what we can describe as inclusionary state activism, which is the use of fiscal revenues, government fiscal financial resources, derived from the export of natural resources, commodities, to finance poverty reduction and other progressive social programs. This policy program, adopted by these progressive regimes, and as I said, most of that South America is now under the sway of these progressive regimes. It was evidently successful, given that the countries that adopted that progressive program from 2002 to 2012, that's the year of the commodity boom on the world market, in other words, the demand for high prices, and to which corresponded precisely the progressive cycle. So both took place almost in parallel form over this 10-year period from 2002 to 2012. But during this period, during these years, from 2000 basically to 2015, the rate of poverty in those countries that adopted the progressive policy regime was reduced on average from between 40 to 50%, which was an amazing achievement considering that the World Bank War on Global Poverty that it declared in 1975, after 25 years, had yielded absolutely zero results. By the end of the last century, 25 years on, the rate of poverty was the same or higher than it was in 1980, for example, right? So it was totally unsuccessful, the World Bank's war on global poverty, which is not surprising considering that its main weapon used in that war was to impose policies of neoliberal globalization that produced poverty, that exacerbated the problem. But anyway, with these progressive regimes, these Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, etc., the poverty rate was reduced significantly. In many cases, as I said, from 40 to 50%. So finally, we have a war against poverty rather than a war against the poor. Other evidence of the efficacy of this post-neoliberal policy agenda is that in countries like Mexico, where the government steadfastly stuck to the neoliberal agenda, the poverty rate remains the same today as it was in 1980, the beginning of this neoliberal policy cycle. In the case of Mexico, for example, anywhere from 46 to 57% of the population are unable to meet their basic needs and are described as poor, half of them extremely poor. It depends on what measure you use or whose statistics you believe. But the government officials themselves, until recently, statistics had the rate of poverty as 57%. This means that half the population are unable to meet their basic needs in an economy that has generated enormous wealth and sprouted at least a dozen billionaires, as well as high level of consumption of material goods by the middle class, substantial middle class. Anyone who's been to Mexico City, for example, will realize that not everyone is poor, that there's a lot of wealth there. And there's a very strong middle class with a high level of consumption capacity, as high as anywhere in the United States or Canada or elsewhere. I mean, you know, these are well-to-do. The substantial upper or just the middle class. There is, of course, a huge lower middle class, formed by people who were lifted out of poverty. Problem being, what happens when you're no longer poor? Do you then enter the middle class? Well, it's a big debate, because of course there's a lot of people who are no longer poor according to official statistics, but still have a very low level of consumption, capacity, and access to education, health services, etc. And would not normally be defined as middle class. Where are they? How would you define these people? Well, I guess we can use the word lower middle class, but it's a very problematic term. In any case, the post-neoliberal policy agenda adopted by these progressive governments turned out to be anything but a panacea. First of all, it was dependent on an extractivist approach to development and reliance on foreign investment for the extraction of natural resources and the export of these resources to meet the growing demand for them on the world market. Secondly, there's a lot of problems associated with this dependence on foreign investment and the use of extractive model, which we haven't got time to go into. Secondly, this extractive approach has proven to be rife with contradictions and is extremely destructive of the livelihoods and viability of those communities close to the sites of extractive activity, resulting in enormous environmental damage and widespread violation of the human and territorial rights of these communities, as well as the widespread resistance and relation of conflict between these communities and the mining companies on the extractive frontier. This is particularly the case for Canada, which dominates worldwide foreign investment in the extraction of gold and silver, etc. 70% of all capital invested in the extraction of these resources based on are done by companies based in Canada. Okay? Which is one reason, I suppose, why the Canadian government under Harper basically abolished CEDA, the government's development studies program, reducing it from an effective program oriented towards the reduction of global poverty into a desk in the Department of External Affairs and Trade, responsible primarily for assisting those mining companies with their conflicts with the communities. And there's hardly a country in Latin America which doesn't have conflict between the mining companies and these communities. It's a sad story. It's made us less proud to be Canadian, especially less proud of the Canadian government, which even under a liberal regime has not reversed these reactionary policies of the Conservative Harper government. Anyway, thirdly, another problem with these progressive policies is that rather than securing a social base for their progressive policies, the regime in each case, for different reasons, pursued a strategy of class conciliation. Let me just expand on this point. Each of the progressive governments, including the most radical expressions of Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, and Rafael Correa in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, the so-called, the governments formed under the red tide. It's like a more radical, based upon a more radical rejection of the neoliberal agenda, as opposed to the center-left governments in Argentina and Chile, Brazil. They're forming what's called the pink tide. Not as radical in their rejection of the neoliberal agenda. And in many cases, a lot of these progressive governments actually govern with important sectors of the oligarchy, the national bourgeoisie, and capitalists. So, like in the case of Brazil, under a very progressive government, in the rural sector, the progressive left-leaning government was allied with the most reactionary force in Parliament, representing the landlords, the big landlords. Anyway, the cold balance of these governments, almost without exception, includes two elements in common. All of them achieved reduction of extreme poverty through programs that included cash transfers to poor households. That was a policy invented by ex-former president, leader of the Workers' Party in Brazil. You know, if you take the World Bank's definition of poverty as extreme poverty is sort of earning or less than, let's say, $1.25 a day, which is a ridiculously conservative measure. Well, in 1 month, you $30. So the program, the poverty reduction program, basically meant transferring to the poor households $30 on condition that a month, on condition that they send the kids to school and to clinics. So, which basically means that, in theory, if not in practice, that automatically, millions of people are lifted out of poverty, no longer poor, or at least from the point of view of government statistics and policy makers. So they're lifted out of poverty through this bonus, this cash transfer programs. And also, the poor were given additional access to what's called financial inclusion, to finance their small enterprises, their little micro businesses, etc., through programs of microfinance or credit, which allow the poor to a higher level of consumption through debt with credit. But with rates of credit of about 40%, up to 40% a month, of course, these programs did more to enrich the microfinance companies and banks than to alleviate the poverty of the poor. Made very little difference. In fact, some my colleagues have described microfinance as a way of underdeveloping a country. In other words, further impoverishing the poor. Even extracting from the poor the little that they have to create more profits for the entrepreneurs, for those who deal with microfinance. Anyway, there were major achievements. Extreme poverty was reduced. That's not an insignificant achievement. But the point is that all of these changes, all of this success was produced without any structural change that favors the interests of the working class, the peasantry, and the rural poor, or the indigenous populations. In other words, these progressive regimes assume the mandate of globalization, working out a deal with the companies and the foreign investors in the extractive sector to share the proceeds derived from the export of resource wealth, like super profits for the companies, a very profitable business to export these natural resources, royalties and export taxes for the governments, although not so much in Mexico, where there is no royalty regime. In other words, Canadian and American companies can extract silver and other minerals without having to pay royalties for the owners of that wealth. And with an effective tax of about 1.2% on the export of those resources, it basically means that, quote, the government extracts 1.2% of the value of those minerals on the world market. Workers don't receive a high percentage, less than 10%, because mining and extractive industry in general does not use much labor. or it's technology intensive. So employing little labor, you don't have the spin-off benefits of wage employment like industry does, like manufacturing industry does. Also, so you have resource rents or royalties and taxes. That's a share of the global value of these products that goes to the governments. And what does the communities in whose territory those resources are extracted from, what do they get? The huge socio-environmental costs and negative consequences. Damage to the health, their environment and their livelihoods with next to no benefits. The sad thing is, I'm talking now of the progressive regimes. When the commodity boom collapsed, high price in the world market collapsed around 2012, these left-leaning progressive regimes no longer had the fiscal revenues with which to finance their poverty reduction and social programs. In Brazil, for example, the GDP went down from a 5% annual rate for the previous 6 years to 0. And has not yet recovered from that collapse. Argentina had a similar experience with the same political result. A swing to the right in subsequent elections, bringing to power forces on the far right with an agenda of restoring a neoliberal policy agenda. In other words, the progressive agenda was dependent on export of these raw materials and high prices for those commodities. And this high prices collapsed, so did the capacity to finance the poverty reduction programs, and therefore creating, as I say, a different political situation, conditions for a swing to the right in the pendulum of electoral politics. So you have election to the presidency of Mauricio Macri in Argentina, Michel Temer in Brazil, and then in the elections 2018, even further to the right in Brazil, Bolsonaro. People heard of Bolsonaro? Yeah. Who's a neoliberal fascist, and I'm using very precise scientific language here. He is a fascist, but of a neoliberal stamp, an authoritarian populist, pretty much in the mold of Donald Trump, if you want to know the truth. Not surprisingly, the collapse of the commodities boom, as it had coincided with the end of the progressive cycle and a swing to the right. But the only of the left regime that did not participate in the swing to the right, the end of the progressive cycle, is Bolivia, which is the only country which still has the social movements backing it, forcing the government to actually listen to the movements. In the other countries, so-called where the progressive regime were founded, the peasant movements that brought them to power, were then sort of cast aside and not taken account of. And of course, that's reflected in the politics, in the swing to the right, where these progressive regimes have lost their important part of the social base. Of course, another exception to the rule is Venezuela. That's a very special case we'll talk about a little bit later. Because in Venezuela, it's the one of these progressive regimes that was not formed in the wake of the backing of a social movement. It was based largely on development from the top within the political class, through the ascent to power of a charismatic individual, etc., Hugo Chavez, etc. Without a social base, without a social movement at its base. Did not even have a base in the cities. It was only when the US engineered a coup in 2002 that lasted only for a couple of days, because then all of the urban poor came down from the shanties down to the center and basically forced them to restore Chavez to power. So, and subsequently, the urban poor has become the primary social, as well as the rural poor, the social base of what in Venezuela they call socialism, or at least an attempt to move in a socialist direction. And by socialism, they don't mean what it means in the US or Trump means. It means, government control and elimination of individual freedoms, etc. It basically means a more equitable distribution of the social product, of, let's say, the resources from production, etc., a more equitable distribution. Socialism means that and nothing more. As well, and also the increased control of workers, of their workplaces, and communities of their communities. That's what socialism means in that context. Now, as I said, the only exception to this progressive cycle was Mexico, or rather to the rightward swing, to this recent swing to the right. Again, it's in Mexico, where presidential elections last year brought to power a coalition of center-left political forces, a national regeneration movement headed by López Obrador, popularly known as AMLO. But, of course, as I said, Mexico was not part of the progressive cycle, but even so, the election of AMLO, who then actually assumed his presidential position at the end of December, has led to a renewal of the hope, on the left anyway, for progressive change. Hope that was dashed with the latest swing of electoral politics, pendulum to the right. So in other words, some see Mexico now with AMLO as a hopeful sign of the beginnings of another possible progressive cycle. But as I said, it's much, much too early to tell whether this hope would be dashed as well. Okay, that's electoral politics. But electoral politics is only one front of the class, what I call the class struggle. This front of the class struggle is based on the relationship of capital to labor. That is, the relationship between the working class or labor and the capitalist class or labor. Yeah, that's. However, in the last cycle of development and resistance, the resistance against the neoliberal policy agenda was led not by workers, whose capacity to resist was destroyed in the 80s, but by the peasantry, or more accurately, the near landless rural workers and the rural poor in the countryside. Nevertheless, in Argentina, for example, last December, over 500,000 workers took to the street to protest President Macri's neoliberal policy measures, very austere program, which does give some people the hope that we have at least the germs, if not the beginnings, of another possible new cycle of resistance in which the working class might finally play a more leading, important role. So that's hard to tell, but some people are saying that these right-wing regimes are generating therefore the conditions of, let's say, working class rejection of their policies, and therefore creating, another possible cycle. It'd be sort of like in the States. You can't imagine that electorate will make the same mistake twice. In 2020, they will elect a similar regime. Same thing in Argentina and Brazil. After 4 years of a very reactionary regime with very reactionary policies, it's hard to imagine that the electorate will re-elect it. And in any case, in the popular sector of society, resistance is already building. against the policies of those right-wing regimes. But as I said, electoral politics is not the only front of the class struggle. There's also what we might call the front of anti-imperialism, the anti-imperialist struggle, based on political resistance, not popular resistance as much as political regime resistance against the interference of the United States in national politics and the efforts of the US government to exert state power, to exercise state power and oppose its will and policies in the region against this resistance. I don't have to explain this to this audience, I imagine, that at the moment this struggle primarily concerns or targets Venezuela, which, as is evident, finds itself right now in the crosshairs of US imperialism and the efforts, at least 10 years long from when Chavez first achieved power, of attempts of regime change, to overthrow the government by any means and every means possible. And lately, this, this effort to depose the democratically elected regime of Maduro is coming to a head. And I'm talking of policies of the US that include massive funding of the opposition, including funding of business owners and merchants for them to keep their product in warehouses rather than putting them on the market for sale in order to generate a food shortage, with the hope of bringing about, a popular revolt. This has been going on for at least 6 years, and you have no idea how much funding is involved in that. And of course, these sort of tactics or weapons used in this imperialist struggle are diverse. They also include, most recently, the support for a non-democratically elected, self-appointed provisional president, someone who's never been elected to anything, but who elected himself as president, and now has been, with the US support, which engineered and had been looking for oppositional forces that would assume that role. Okay, so they more or less they financed and put him into power, and now are trying to concert the support of other governments in the region and beyond to support their strategy. And as it happens for them, luckily, many governments in South America have turned toward the right, so he has no problem in finding, allies in this struggle. So 14 out of 37 states support the US position on this. And there's also been very serious attempts to undermine the economy, including sanctions of all sorts, as well as creating conditions that has more or less pushed the Venezuelan economy into an incredibly severe economic crisis, with unheard of, levels of inflation, and of course with the absence of food, etc., creating an absolutely critical situation for the working population. Venezuela was already hurting because of its, not so much because of mistaken policy, and the government made a lot of mistakes, but the big mistake was not to diversify the economy and to rely on the export of oil to finance its program. So 96% of all government is financed through the export of oil. So if the export price of oil falls by 50%, well, you don't have to go too far to look for problems, right? And then if the US manages to basically, how do you say, impose conditions like they did on Cuba, which makes it impossible to access credit, etc., on global markets, etc. Anyway, the end result has been devastating. But this is based on, not by happenstance, but based on a clear strategy to undermine the economy. And as I said, they've been working at this for years now, and it looks like they're getting very close to achieving their goal. I can't imagine that the Venezuelan government will be able to resist this kind of attack, this kind of assault for too much longer. But anyway, to turn for a moment back to Mexico, I really should be finished by now. Let's see if I can wrap this up. But to turn back to Mexico and AMLO, whether or not he will deliver on his promise and revive hopes on the left for progressive change, whether he represents the possible beginnings of another progressive cycle in Latin America, it's too early to tell. The litmus test is whether he will move, and how quickly he will move towards a post-neoliberal policy agenda that will result in a more inclusive form of development with a dramatic reduction in the rate of poverty and social inequality in the distribution of income and assets. And of course, who knows? This is in many places described as socialism. And even in Mexico, the word socialism in many circles is viewed negatively. One disturbing sign regarding a progressive agenda in his government, in AMLO's government, is his recent proposal, I don't know how many people are aware of this, to advance a mega development project in the form of a Maya train. A train that will link in the Mayan area 5 states. In the mega development project, estimated to cost $7.4 billion. To build a railroad through 5 states, he has invited the participation of private investors to share investment in the project, which is estimated, it is estimated will generate hundreds of thousands of jobs, as well as opportunities for investors to make a lot of money. The problem, however, one of many, is that at least a third of the planned route passes through a biosphere of pristine jungle, and the owners of the land, the Mayan people, have not been consulted. So the issue again will be, who will benefit from that macro development project? Who will bear the costs? The heavy social environmental costs that are inevitable with any mega development project. So right now, this is the beginning of another form of resistance and a struggle where the indigenous population, including the Zapatistas in the south, they're mobilizing to try to stop or to protest this development. Anyway, what I'm saying is that it doesn't augur well for the progressive agenda of this government if they're already moving against the wishes and wills and the interests of the indigenous population. Okay, let me just go through all this, no time. Don't forget this. You guys. Holy cow, this as well. I'm just going to go to a conclusion now, if I can find it, if I can get it. Oh, yeah, I was going to go through that. Oh, yeah. Resistance takes different forms. One form of resistance is protest, the construction of social movements to mobilize the forces of resistance. That's the dominant form of resistance. But resistance can also take the form of, let's say, constructing, or let's say, not attacking capitalism. Because the argument, like I said, the Zapatista says, you don't want to sort of attack the beast, because the more you attack it, it's like a hide over many heads. You just lop off one head, it just grow another. And by attacking it, you can't beat it. you can't win. The only way to win is basically withdraw from it, not feed it, not give it nutrients. So what they have done is develop an alternative strategy of community-based local development to construct a social solidarity economy based on worker self-management, cooperativism, and local development. So it's a form of alternative development, local development, which is also a form of resistance. This is the form that resistance takes, to construct an economy on the margins of the dominant capitalist system. This form of resistance is taking hold. All across Latin America, you can find instances of these efforts to construct a social solidarity economy. I think it's a very, very important form of resistance. It also brings up Venezuela, where the project to bring about socialism is not only advanced, quote, from above, in other words, through actions and policies taken by the government, but from below, from within the communities. So one very positive thing that the Venezuelan government has done is institute let's say, the creation of community-based organizations, community councils that make almost all the decisions relating to production, who gets what, etc., and cooperatives. When Chavez took power, there were fewer than 800 cooperatives in the country. Today there are 75,000 cooperatives. So this is a side of Venezuelan socialism that you never hear about. And so rather, just looking at the electoral or political struggle, one should also be mindful of what's happening within, below. So the fate of Venezuela, and again it's fighting a horrible battle, it's at the national level, but the fate of whether it will survive will depend not only on the power of the US to depose, create regime change, but also what's happening inside the country. I forget what else I was going to make up, so I better end on this point. Thank you.
Okay. So you have plenty of time to take comments and questions, try and keep them short, as well as your responses, so that everybody gets an opportunity to participate.
I've said everything I have to say anyway. So.
We want you to participate. So I'll start here.
Where does China fit into the extraction of the resources in South America? What is China's influence?
China is now Latin America's most important, greatest investor.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, if you have a question or comment, if I could get you to stand up. I can't pass around the mic to everybody, but if you could stand up and project.
Okay,
just repeat them.
The question was, what is China's influence in Latin America in terms of extraction of resources and investment of capital? And where's that going to go?
Well, China is the most important investor now in Latin America, more so than the US. And it's investing it is investing in infrastructure, but primarily in conditions that will lead to the extraction of resources and the export of those resources, natural resources, to China. China is also buying up land. This is called land grabbing. So rather than importing, buying from Latin American producers, it buys the land and then brings in its own workers or labor, and it produces on the land, so it exports it back home. Anyway, China needs natural resources, and it is primarily responsible for the primary commodities boom. And even though in the last few years the economy has slowed down, its level of investment in extraction of resources is still very high and very significant. And with some positive impacts, because the Chinese government apparently is giving to the owners of these resources a better deal than American investors give. Let's say more, they submit to higher taxes and more royalties. But apparently the overall, because they have problems, they like to bring in their own labor rather than using domestic labor. So one of the few little benefits that the extractive model would give is then taken away. And in addition to that, the environmental impact of Chinese investments in the extractive sector have been absolutely horrendous, extremely negative. There have been a lot of studies on this, on the negative impact, environmental impact of Chinese investments.
Next question? Any women in the group that would like to ask? I'd love to get an opportunity to alternate. Go ahead.
I've just been told I have to behave. I took exception to a number of the points that you made, but I would just like to follow up on this gentleman's question. Your presentation was very anti-American, and I understand that, but given the role that China is playing globally, whether in Latin America or in Africa, which has been going on for decades in some cases, why do you present a talk like you just gave and you never mention China in that talk? I think it's time to really examine more closely on public discussions what China is doing.
You didn't have time. You just have time.
Okay, very quickly. I take your point, but it was simply not my topic. My topic for today was the dynamics of Latin American politics. And I can tell you that China so far has had negligible, or if not zero, impact on the, let's say, Latin American politics, where the US has intervened in national affairs and had a very important role in Latin American politics for a century.
The
question I wanted to ask is the point that you ended on with regard to Venezuela. You mentioned the cooperatives that were promoted under the Bolivarian Revolution. There were also the promotion of communal councils. Yes. The idea being to build at the local level self-governance structures that could eventually link up and form a new state. Now that process did not go very far before major troubles occurred, but I'm just wondering, do you have a sense as to, one of the benefits of that was to politicize people, to organize people at the local level so they can participate more effectively in the affairs of the country. And so the question is, if the Maduro government were to fall, or if there were just elections and a coalition government came in, whatever, how strong do you think these base level organizations in civil society are? How capable will they be to represent the interests of the popular classes?
Well, you sort of answered your own question. No, it's an extremely important development. It's had very important positive effects. And as I mentioned, you have to take into account the weight of this new institution. Very, very important. I would say this, if the government were to fall, and it very well might, these councils are certainly nowhere near have the capacity to take over the state or form a state. But they will constitute an enormous reservoir and form of resistance against public policy if it were to swing to the right and abandon the socialist agenda. Because now, in other words, these local institutions, they have educated a large number of rural and urban poor who never before in Latin America or elsewhere have participated in the political process. But for the first time, you have a large segment of the Venezuelan population, the poor, that are participating. And I don't think whatever government places them can shove them aside easily.
In the back.
Two questions. One, what is the role of narco traffic in the economies and actually in the policies, because they are a factor of influence in Latin America? And the second one, in your comments regarding Venezuela, I hope you acknowledge that the regime of Maduro has made very serious challenges to the law, to the internal law. I mean, by adjudicating, or by the court, allowing the court, for example, to take powers of the legislative power. And there have been substantial acts against democracy committed by the government. And the fact that there are 3 million people who have left Venezuela says quite a lot on what people think of what is going on.
Yeah, I agree. No, very important point. On that last point, yes, you have a million people have migrated, escaping what? Socialist policies. The fact is that the policy of the regime are not very socialist. They're moving in a social direction, a lot of rhetoric, but in practice, there were no, let's say, the commanding heights of the economy were still in, of course you have the state company, that's always control the government, what it always has been, but in the main sectors of the economy, it's still in control of the capitalist and business sector. And it's not yet, they would like to move in a social direction, but they're not. What these million people are escaping is conditions of absolute economic crisis, the collapse of the economy, and what I've already explained, that the Maduro regime is responsible, certainly in part, for creating those conditions, but nowhere near what is being portrayed. The collapse of the global economy has a lot to do with it, and the impact of the US actions have been to create those conditions should not be underestimated. I would say it is the dominant factor in the creation of the conditions that is leading to this migration. It's a horrible situation, but you have to look at the picture. You have to look at the overall picture and understand the forces at work here, right? Rather than becoming sort of taking an ideological position. Oh, that the government this, Maduro government this, Maduro government that. Maduro is no angel, but he's democratically elected. Yes, a lot of people don't, some people in the US don't accept the last elections because the opposition boycotted it. And the reason they boycotted it is primarily because they knew they would lose any electoral contest. Okay? Now, there are issues involved that some people, opposition leaders, were disqualified from participating in elections. Because some of them were, by the courts, let's say, prohibited from participating in public policies because of corruption, graft, etc. And one major policy, a political opposition member, was basically convicted for fomenting, let's say, violence in the streets. So he was sort of, again, as you would in the States, prohibited from participating in that process. So all I'm saying is there's a lot of issues involved, and you have to understand how they all work together. What was the first question again? Narco. Yes. The sale of drugs represents at least 10% of the GDP in Latin America. And you have a large number of people for which an enormous business, very profitable business across different countries, but especially in Mexico, Colombia, Mexico, and in Central America, Honduras and Salvador, where the drug traffickers play a very important point in the economy, to the point that they will create what we call in our book, they will probably eventually be transformed into capitalists. In other words, into runners of legitimate businesses. Because if you have these billions of dollars, many of which are laundered through the biggest banks in the U.S., right, according to U.S. Senate reports. The problem with all of this money, what do you do with it? You can't spend it all. They don't know what to do with it, to spend it. Because speaking of consumption, you can only take up a small part of it. A lot of it is distributed to others in order to keep themselves in power, etc., etc. But what's going on is what is not being studied, because it's difficult to study, is the investment of those narco dollars in creation of legitimate businesses. So that's why we call it, it's a new form of capitalism, narco-capitalism. It's sort of like in Canada, like the Royal Bank of Canada, the biggest bank in the country, was based on in its origins on the proceeds of fortunes made in rum running. In other words, illegal economic activity, but that was a long time ago. It is now a very legitimate, respectable capitalist enterprise.
Next question, the gentleman right over there. Could you stand up?
The Chinese concern me immensely from the aspect that they are supplying all of their own labor, all of their own materials, and all the people to run whatever it is they're building, which gives them control over whatever they're building, but also gives them a tremendous voting block in those countries. And that's what concerns me, is the voting block that's coming from all these countries that they are taking care of in their own way.
You're talking voting power of Chinese?
Chinese, yes. I know in Ecuador they're building a tremendous institution in Ecuador, scientific research institute in Ecuador. And all the people going in, all the equipment, all the materials come from China. And the people will stay in Ecuador and become citizens. And that gives them a tremendous voting block there.
Well, I agree with you, except in terms of the political impact. I don't think of those Chinese who will stay in the country. The Chinese, okay, you have some laborers, but they're primarily engineers and administrators, you know, that will stay in the country as long as the project is viable, etc. But in any case, they constitute an extremely minuscule part of the population with negligible impact. I disagree in terms of the political impact. I think the political impact of the Chinese, despite the impact of the investment, the political impact is zero. That's my view.
Yes.
So, what I know most about is Nicaragua.
Stand up, please.
Much of what you're talking about is apparent there too. But what is interesting to me is that when the leftists were in power, the Sandinistas, there was free education, free schooling, and people were doing so much better. Literacy went up from 50% to like 90-something. Then we get the neoliberal period, which lasted for 16 years. No free education, no free schooling, and people sinking back into their private lives and making money by selling this and that on the street. So then we have this Sandinista back in office, Daniel Ortega, a different way of thinking than he was 25 years ago. And his wife, Rosario Murillo. They are dictators. They have, the Constitution has been changed, and they can be in power for as long as they want. And neoliberals are starting to react to them. But the masses of people, the masses of poor people are very happy. They have a lot of bonos, techo roof, piece of floor. They have free education again and free medical care. And scholarships for people to go to university. And a lot is being done for the poorest of the poor and the very fragile lower middle class. I'd like your comment on this, please.
Well, I think I agree with your comments. I think I agree with your assessment of the conditions in Nicaragua, and they've gone through the same cycle, move from the left to the right, etc. The only problem is when you're talking of Ortega, you're talking of a very strange person. He's not a normal or even an abnormal leftist, for example. He's not a leftist at all. Even though he was a commander in the struggle, he is not a leftist. And even though he has in part a left-oriented program, as you mentioned, especially in terms of education, he is. You also realize he's born again, right?
Yes.
So, he's, I don't know, I would say he's a born again, pragmatic, and dogmatic neoliberal, more than a leftist. With a pragmatic or dogmatic neoliberal with, how do you say, contradictory tendencies in his policies.
Next question, gentleman on the side in the back.
Could you just take a minute and comment on Cuba?
The question was, can he comment on Cuba?
Cuba, you notice it's all these developments, well, in the last, 20 years, a total outlier. You never hear of it. It's going through its own struggle. Of course, it's still struggling against conditions of U.S. sanctions, so it is extremely difficult for a small island state to construct an economy based on resources that you need but can't access from within, and trade is blocked or it's very expensive. You can't access the capital needed to invest in this industry, so it's very difficult. So they're continuing to, let's say, adjust as best they can to very difficult circumstances, but they're also going through a process of, let's say, reform. Because they realize that the model, for whatever reason, is not working. Like, it's still not producing. Okay, it's producing the best educated, the healthy population, most healthy population in the region, in Latin America, right? And you don't have the extreme poverty that you have everywhere else. You don't have that. You have sort of poverty in the sense of low consumer capacity, the capacity to consume goods that are available on the market. But they have universal free education, health, etc. And there's a lot of, let's say, very good positive outcomes. But it's still a poor economy. So they have to do something else. So they're basically struggling with, experimenting with economic reform, to reform the economic structure of the economy. One of the reforms that it is experimenting with is, in fact, we've written a book for this, and Cliff was part of it, contributed to that book, which is to basically reform it in the sense of creating more power or capacity of local and regional communities to make decisions that affect their lives and production. So through the formation of cooperatives and the strengthening of local governments in the development process. So this is going on, sort of, and that is going to have not only it will probably, as I mentioned before, local community-based local development is a very important element of or solution to not only Cuba but elsewhere. So that's very positive, and it will probably also have a positive impact on the what might call democracy. In other words, it's of democratizing decision making, making it less centered in the government. I consider the government to be very representative of the population, much more so than, let's say, in Canada or the US, where you may have a dictatorship of money. You have to be a millionaire to have any, to be able to participate in the organs of the state. Whereas in Cuba you have housewives, you have fishermen, you have, if you look at the composition of the, let's say, the parliament, the assembly, it's not unlike the composition of the population as a whole. So it's very representative. Nevertheless, the institutional mechanisms of Cuban politics means that power or decision making is too concentrated at the top. And you have to decentralize. And it's happening, and I have my fingers crossed that this move toward decentralization will work to both improve the economy, increase local, let's say, increase the level of local, if not national, economic development, and help further improve the democratization process. But here you have Cliff. He has a much more important role to play in this. I think he takes groups each year, don't you, to Cuba still, to show them what it's like, what's happening in Cuba.
Yes, it's about Cuba. This morning I read about the Russians giving an awful lot of money to Cuba to help their military complex. How is that going to play out with the Americans?
Well, I think to the degree that are you American? Okay. To the degree that the current president understands what's happening, he's not going to like it. He's not going to like it. What he'll do, who knows? It's hard to do more, because Cuba's been a thorn in the U.S. side for forever, and there's not much more that they can do, because they've done everything short of invading the country, because they know they cannot do, because it would mean a terrible loss of American lives, and of course, even your President Trump could not allow that, could not survive that.
The gentleman all the way there.
You mentioned how neoliberalism created this strong concentration of capital, and I'm wondering if, since the early 80s or whatever, and I'm wondering if there are any countries, initiatives that you can tell us about that stop that trend or even reverse it?
I'm not quite sure I understand. Initiatives related to what?
To redistribute the wealth from the extremely, from the 1%, let's say.
Okay.
Or even from the Mexican millionaires.
Well, as you know, the neoliberal model has now been in place in the US and elsewhere for 3 decades now. And it has generated the most extreme, let's say, disparities in the distribution of wealth and income. That is the main outcome of the neoliberal model. It's very exclusive, designed to benefit the rich and the powerful, based on the theory that if you put money in the hands of the rich, they know what to do with it. They will invest it rather than consume it. If you give it to the poor, they just spend it and the economy doesn't grow. If you want the economy to grow, well, you have to give money to the rich. Give money to the rich, everyone will benefit somehow. So that is the ideology that underlies neoliberalism. It has absolutely no factual basis. It's not just simply fake news, it's fake analysis. Total. Anyway, the forces in support of the neoliberal agenda, though, are very, very powerful. That neoliberal agenda has created, as I say, like in the United States, a division to the point where 1% of the population disposes of at least 50% of income and a higher percentage of wealth. That is absolutely incredible and totally unsustainable, although in the US they've managed to sustain it, but it's very difficult to introduce a policy program that will halt or reverse that. The only thing you can do is impose a policy program designed to basically very heavily tax the rich. You can actually put a 2% tax on your top 1% and they will not even notice it. But it will have a tremendous impact on benefiting the lives of the middle and working classes. And even that very weak, minimalist proposal in the US it's not going to work. It's going to be seen as you heard in Trump 2 days ago, we're going to make sure that will never come to the US socialism, which basically means to put limits on the capacity of the rich and powerful to make more money to benefit themselves, not anybody else. There's a very interesting in the Democratic side of the Congress, some very interesting proposals, very interesting progressive voices. All we can do is hope that these progressive voices can get louder and louder, and then by the time 2020 comes around, the electorate will know that a billionaire, and every senator in the US Senate is a millionaire, sorry, at least a millionaire. A billionaire is not going to act in their interest.
Questions? Any more? I have a question, a general question that kind of intrudes into this whole process, which is climate change. And we've talked about, or you have talked about, increasing capacity of people to raise their standard of living. And obviously there's a big disparity between the North and the South in that capacity. What do you think all of these processes, how do you see the convergence of increasing the capacity of people to consume and the impending climate catastrophe that we're all looking at maybe as soon as 10 to 20 years?
Yes, well, the only solution is if in countries like the US they adopt, I guess what's being called now politically in the US as a Green Deal. Someone like the old deal in the 30s, with the same kind of scope and impact, that is the only way out, a Green Deal. You have to go, not grab little by little, but you have to go move fast, because time's running out, towards a green economy, constructing a green economy and get rid of this fossil fuels in the economy. So I think it's an absolutely major issue, climate change in the world, and it's absolutely disgraceful how some politicians absolutely either deny it or ignore it and will not do anything about it. And hopefully that the electorate will change the government before it is too late to elect a government that will introduce a Green Deal. And in Europe and various countries, you have a lot of governments that are moving in that direction and are ready to well, introduce a Green Deal. In Canada, I have not heard of any talk of a Green Deal yet. Trudeau is caught in he too is in certain contradictions. So I don't know if he'll survive those contradictions.
Peter?
Well,